I think we'll kick off. This webinar is being recorded, and it's going to go up on the ECOWind website as well, so it will be available to people who can't make it today. But thank you all for coming. My name's Dickon Howell. I'm a director at HMC, and I am leading the champions team for both the ECOWind and EcoFlow programs. For those of you that don't know, the ECOWind program is a NERC funded program that's funded jointly with NERC, the Offshore Wind Evidence and Change Programme, and the Crown Estate Scotland. And the programme is looking at the ecological effects of offshore wind, and we've got 4 projects that are looking at various parts of the ecosystem, from top predators down to physical processes, benthic habitats. As part of our champions role within the ECOWind programme, we have a responsibility to make sure that our researchers, our PIs, are as clued up about what's going on in the policy space as possible. And we've done this through various mechanisms over the last few years. But we thought that actually this year, as we're getting into at the business end of the programme, we would set up a series of policy masterclass webinars, and this is the first one. It's worth noting that today we've got Kim from the HMC team, who's going to be talking about the entire UK marine policy landscape, which is no mean feat in 20 minutes, because there is a lot to cover. Kim will touch on it, that there is also further reading for you, and Kim will talk to you a bit more about that. Today we are going to touch on lots of information at a fairly high level, but I just wanted to reassure everybody that we have many more of these webinars coming. So our next one's going to be on the 15th of May, where we're going to talk about strategic compensation. We're then going to run through various topics, as you can see here, including cumulative impact assessment, marine net gain, the new English seabird conservation and recovery pathway, marine management scenarios and marine spatial planning, 5 capitals approach to marine management, fisheries policy and management, and marine monitoring. And to do this, we're going to draw on the expertise of my team at HMC, who are all working on these topics, mainly for government, but also supporting academics and sometimes the private sector. But we're also hoping to get representatives from particularly government, but also the developer community, to come and support us and sit in on the panel discussion. Today it's just HMC staff sitting in on the panel discussion, and yeah, hopefully we'll be able to have some good discussion. So we've got an hour, and we're 10 minutes in. I've finished the introduction. I'm shortly going to be handing over to Kimberly Lloyd, who's going to be running us through 20 minutes or so presentation on the policy landscape for 2024. We're then going to have a panel discussion that will include myself, and I'm working across a variety of topics in the marine policy space, and my colleagues, Ed Wilsteed. Ed is currently Ed's a fishery specialist of 20 years, and is currently working on fisheries management plans, climate adaptive fisheries management, and various other fisheries topics, including chairing the ICES group on fisheries and offshore wind. Henk, who runs both ECOWind, EcoFlow, and the Insight programme, but also has got years of experience in JNCC as a benthic ecologist. Ness, who is our head of natural capital in HMC, and has been working on lots of really interesting projects, including the next phase of Natural England's Maripo initiative, and developing a 5 capitals approach to marine planning for the MMO, and Kim's going to be talking us through the main policy landscape. Kim's an offshore wind specialist within our team, and she's going to sit in on the panel. We'll have a panel discussion between us. We've got a couple of questions that we think would be interesting to talk through, and then we'll be taking questions from attendees. To try and manage those questions, I'm going to ask that people put questions in the chat so that I can then chair that effectively, rather than trying to get through potentially 39 people putting their hands up, and we won't get through that in time. So without further ado, to make sure we do have time for that Q&A at the end, I'm going to hand over to Kim, who's going to run us through a presentation on the policy landscape for 2024. Over to you, Kim.
Thanks, Dickon. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Kimberly Lloyd. I'm a consultant at HMC, and as Dickon said, my background's in offshore wind. So I currently work across both the ECOWind and the EcoFlow research programmes. And today I'm going to be discussing this, the latest offshore wind policy and delivery landscape. This will be published on both the ECOWind and EcoFlow websites from today onwards. So you can find more detail on the background and the full policy landscape for offshore wind and how the research programmes can contribute directly in the landscape report. So as you can see here, the policy landscape is quite complex, and it would take me all day to cover it thoroughly. So in this talk, I'll just be covering the key areas we thought would be useful to highlight. So this is going to be a high-level overview. As Dickon said, I only have 20 minutes to cover the entire UK marine policy space, so bear with me. And there is a lot more detail in the report. So we are all aware of the energy targets we need to meet, but just for a quick recap, so far we have a total of 78 gigawatts of capacity has been identified as potential opportunity, but additional 32 gigawatts is yet to be identified to reach our 2050 targets. In the autumn statement, which came out November last year, the UK government confirmed its intention to work with the Crown Estate to bring forward additional floating wind in the Celtic Sea through the 2030s, and this could see an additional 12 gigawatts of generation deployed. So some quick updates around the leasing rounds. Round 4 agreements for lease process concluded in January 2023 with the addition of 6 new projects. The Celtic Sea Round 5 is underway with 3 project development areas identified, as well as 3 test and development sites. In February this year, a concession notice confirmed the launch of the Round 5 tender process, and that was published, and that actually concludes today, the 18th of April 2024. The Crown Estate is also proposing to add an additional 4 gigawatts of capacity from 7 offshore wind farms that are already in development, due to the improvement of offshore wind technology. They are currently undertaking a plan-level HRA, habitat regulations assessment, to understand the collective impact of these additional, of these 7 offshore wind projects. We also have the ScotWind leasing round, which is plan-led. So this means that all sites within the areas of the seabed have been identified in the Scottish Government's sectoral marine plan for offshore wind. And this includes 13 floating and 7 fixed offshore wind farms. And lastly, we have the innovation and targeted oil and gas round for renewable electricity supplied directly to 7 oil and gas infrastructure projects and 5 small-scale innovative projects. So what is marine planning? Well, marine planning provides the strategic direction for all human activities in UK waters. It doesn't directly manage these activities, but it does provide the context and the direction within which management takes place. So a few updates to marine plans this year across the UK include the England East marine plans are being replaced following a 3-year reporting cycle. So by 2027, we anticipate the adoption of both the East inshore and the offshore marine plans. In Scotland, we have the National Marine Plan that's being updated to better tackle the challenges of climate change and biodiversity loss. So the National Marine Plan 2 will aim to manage the increased competition for space and resource in the marine environment. So this process started last year, and this will probably take several years to complete. However, the Scottish sectoral marine plan for offshore wind is also being adopted, and the revised plan is expected by spring 2025. And this will be focused on minimising potential adverse effects on other sea users, economic sectors and the environment, and maximising opportunities for commercial scale of offshore wind development, including deeper water technologies. So we also have the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan, which is being produced as part of a wider planning reform to accelerate offshore wind. So this was based on the recommendations from the Electricity Networks Commissioner's report, which came out in August last year. And this will be setting out the locations and timing of energy infrastructure to support the energy targets. So these plans are all being supported by the following research programmes. There is new evidence produced by the ScotMer programme, which is now feeding into that sectoral marine plan for offshore wind. And this data will also be used in environmental assessments for the new ScotWind developments. The Marine Spatial Prioritisation Programme is aiming to address the increasing current and future demands for the sea. So they are looking at how to maximise co-location between all sea users and prioritise use of marine space to better manage the increasing spatial squeeze. So they will be producing maps of optimal areas for marine activities, which will facilitate trade-off decisions for sectors including wind, fishing and nature recovery, which is treated as its own sector. So the outputs of the MSPRI programme will inform the development of the updated plans for England and the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan. The Crown Estate has also developed the Whole of Seabed programme, and this is to enhance the coordination of future activities. It's anticipated that the whole of seabed will need to account for a range of different factors, including options for expanding offshore wind, infrastructure such as cables and pipelines, nature efforts, and this includes habitat restoration, biodiversity enhancement, and nature recovery. Also coastal development, so ports and harbours, storage solutions, including carbon capture, utilisation and storage, hydrogen, natural gas facilities, as well as mineral extraction, such as reclamation, aggregate dredging and marine mining. It's a very busy space. The Whole of Seabed programme is developing significant spatial planning capability within the Crown Estate, and that will be supporting other planning bodies such as the MMO, the MSPRI, the Crown Estate plan level environmental assessments. So moving on to energy policy, the British Energy Security Strategy includes commitment to deliver several policy changes to achieve energy targets, including reducing consent time from 4 years down to 1 year, and making environmental considerations at a more strategic level to allow the process to be sped up while improving marine environment. The Nationally Significant Infrastructure Project Action Plan, the NSIPs, were published last year, and they've committed to bring in reforms to ensure that the existing system can actually support our future infrastructure needs by making the consent process better, faster, greener, fairer and more resilient by 2025. So the National Policy Statements for Energy, which came out last year, announced plans to reform both environmental impact assessments and strategic environmental assessments. So this update included assessment guidance to focus on avoidance, mitigation, compensation and good design. Also, the MPS for renewable energy infrastructure referred to the need for improving the evidence base for future compensation measures. And they also noted the need to consider the diverse nature of the UK fishing industry when assessing impacts. So we need to reflect that offshore wind developments can have both positive and negative impacts on fisheries. The Offshore Wind Environmental Improvement Package is a DEFRA programme focusing on environmental assessment reform to support offshore wind delivery. So in February this year, they consulted on policies to inform guidance for MPA assessment and how compensation measures should be delivered. The OWEEP also focuses on strategic compensation, the Marine Recovery Fund, and strategic monitoring. They are currently developing the offshore wind environmental design standards. So this will set a minimum common requirement for designing offshore wind projects to provide a standard approach to mitigation and potentially reducing the need for compensation. So DEFRA is currently developing these and a consultation is expected later this year. The Collaboration on Offshore Wind Strategic Compensation Working Group, CAOSC, they involve multi-sector stakeholders, the Crown Estate and Crown Estate Scotland, and they are developing strategic compensation measures to be used in the library of measures for the Marine Recovery Fund. So the first 3 measures have been recommended, and these are predator reduction or eradication for seabirds, artificial nesting towers for black-legged kittiwakes in the English North Sea, so the kittiwake hotels, designation of additional MPAs for benthic habitats. So these are to compensate for the round 3 extensions and round 4 offshore wind impacts. But more evidence is needed to support these measures, as well as developing additional measures, particularly as offshore wind development moves into new locations, such as the Celtic Sea. The Round 4 Habitat Regulations Assessment concluded that there will be potential negative impacts for kittiwakes from the Flamborough and Filey Coast SPA and sandbanks within the Dogger Bank SAC. So to move forward, they've requested a derogation from DESNES, contingent that the impacts will be offset by compensation measures. So strategic plan level compensation measures are being identified by the Crown Estate, and the plan level kittiwake compensation plan was published in February this year. And this said the preferred measure of kittiwake prey enhancement through the management of sandal fisheries. However, this measure might not be available as a compensation measure for round 4, so they're proposing strategic artificial nesting structures as an alternative. And so moving on to environmental policy, the Environmental Improvement Plan now translate the ambitions from the 25-year plan into actionable measures. A legally binding target for England was set within the Environmental Target MPA Regulations 2023, and they require that at least 70% of protected features in English MPAs to be in a favourable condition by December 2042, with the rest in recovering condition, as well as all other protected features to be in recovering condition. The UK Marine Strategy aims to provide the environmental framework for delivering marine policy at the UK level. The second implementation cycle has been published. Part 3 programme of measures was expected to be published in 2023 and will define a programme of measures for assessing the status of the UK seas up to 2027. So work is ongoing within DEFRA looking at reform of the UK Marine Strategy in line with the 3rd implementation cycle this year. Moving on to marine net gain. Marine net gain is at a really early stage of development. In December, DEFRA's consultation on the principles of marine net gain were published, and these stated that marine net gain assessment framework will include impacts on both habitats and species, It will recognise wider environmental benefits that biodiversity enhancement can deliver, but at the same time, it will maintain the nature-first approach, with net gain for biodiversity being the core requirement. The assessment will continue to explore the role of positive incidental effects, particularly around artificial reefs, and exclusionary effects such as fisheries pressure reduction. It will continue to explore potential design options for the delivery of marine net gain, including contributions-based and metric-style approaches. And lastly, we'll provide clarity on how marine net gain will sit alongside biodiversity net gain at the coast. The first 3 highly protected marine areas in English waters were designated in July last year. This initial pilot phase of the 3 HPMAs will inform future policy and the exploration for additional sites. It's expected that fisheries management measures within the HPMAs will be implemented early this year. And the delivery of the HPMAs will identify areas where development is prohibited, as well as defining assessment requirements and evidence needs to allow the protection and recovery of marine ecosystems. So it will provide an understanding of the recovery potential of different habitat types and ecosystems, and help in defining what good looks like in the absence of human activities and pressures. In 2023, the Scottish Government consulted on proposals to designate at least 10% of Scottish seas as HPMAs by 2026. In response to the findings of the consultation, this proposal is not currently being taken forward. The Cabinet Secretary therefore announced her intention that while remaining firmly committed to enhancing marine protection, the Scottish Government will no longer seek to implement HPMAs. And moving on to fisheries policy, this was a really important addition to the landscape document, as it's an area that can often get overlooked. So starting with the Fisheries Act 2020, this creates the legal requirement for all UK fisheries policy authorities to produce a joint fisheries statement. So I've listed here the responsibilities of these authorities, which I'll quickly touch on. So adopt an ecosystem-based approach to management, implement management measures for protecting spawning and nursery areas of key stocks, publishing fisheries management plans for stocks of socio-economic importance at risk of significant overexploitation or that hold ecosystem significance. Understanding important areas for key fisheries for marine planning considerations and facilitating co-location of activities. Aligning FMPs with marine plans for the effective use of marine space and resources. Developing the network of protected sites to protect specific habitats and species of importance. Acknowledge the importance of the protection, restoration and sustainable management of blue carbon habitats to support adaptation and resilience to climate change. The UK Bycatch Mitigation Initiative is outlining how the fishery policy authorities will achieve these objectives. So through scientific monitoring and research, identifying bycatch hotspots of high risk, adopting effective mitigation measures and working with partners to reduce the bycatch of sensitive species globally. So the Joint Fisheries Statement committed the UK Government to deliver 43 fisheries management plans. The first 5 were published in December. The next 5 for English waters will be published by the end of the year. And DEFRA is also preparing a further 4 FMPs, which will be published by the end of 2025. And these include English waters, Celtic Sea, and Welsh waters. The third National Adaptation Plan mandates the UK Government to enhance the resilience of fish stocks vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So policymakers and fisheries managers are now seeking to integrate climate change into fisheries management. DEFRA has in publication a climate adaptive fisheries report, and this is pinpointing evidence gaps for integrating ecosystem and climate change considerations into management strategies. Some of those evidence gaps include identifying marine habitat and species location, extent, and abundance, and metrics to assess the condition of those, but also the ecosystem dynamics, so interactions, life history traits, habitat characteristics, and primary productivity, as well as the causal effects of species range shifts, assessing short-term socioeconomic impacts on fishes, designating areas for offshore wind developments, and monitoring the effectiveness of the interventions that address biodiversity and climate change. So the report concludes that ecosystem-focused management, including climate-induced impacts, can contribute to a more adaptive and sustainable fisheries management. Recommendations include embedding climate change at all steps of the fisheries management process, including demonstrating how climate change risks have been assessed and how management measures address those risks. And lastly, implementing adaptation measures as a package, so a suite of measures that work together and build towards climate adaptive fisheries. And to summarise, here is a timeline infographic, which will be published on the ECOWind and EcoFlow websites if you want to take a closer look. But this maps out everything we've discussed today on a timeline. So some of the key energy highlights this year include the floating offshore wind, environmental impact assessment scoping, round 4 and round 5, HRA and EIAs, strategic spatial energy plan, the environmental design standards, and the DESNZ policy review. And the key environmental highlights this year include DEFRA's MPA guidance, the fisheries management in MPAs to be concluded, as well as the UK seabird conservation strategy. The marine natural capital and ecosystem assessment will be delivered, and the launch of the strategic compensation pilots. The delivery of the marine net gain assessment framework and the release of fisheries management plans. So we have a really, really busy year ahead of us, but these plans and programmes are exactly where ECOWind and EcoFlow research can have a really big impact. Thank you. I'll pass back over to Dickon.
Thank you, Kim. That was a lot of information to get through in a really short period of time, so thank you. I would recommend that if anyone wants to read any of that in more detail, to go and have a look at the policy landscape. I don't think it's uploaded quite yet on the website, but it will be by close of play today, I think. So if you want to check that, that would be great. And if you have any questions on anything that's in there, then please do come to us at EcoWind Champions. Could you go to the next slide, Kim? So I'm going to invite my colleagues to turn their cameras on. So Ed, Hank, Ness and Kim, if you could, that would be great. And I'm going to see if we can spotlight everybody just quickly so that we are all there. So I think, Kim, if you could stop sharing your screen, that would be great. So we've got 25 minutes and we're going to have a bit of a panel discussion. If anyone wants to ask any questions, as I said, please do put them in the Q&A or the chat. I'm going to start us off though. We've got experts on the call with us today from fisheries, research impact, natural capital and offshore wind. And all of us are working in this space all the time on that interface between the academic world, the government policy world, and the developer world. One of the questions we always get asked is how can research create the most value in the policy landscape? This is a really kind of vital question, not least because it's important for things like REF, but also because our academic colleagues are working really hard at the cutting edge and they want to know that their research can make a difference in the real world. there are lots of kind of things in and around here. There are often disconnects between how quickly people in government need information, and how quickly that information can be produced within the research community, whether government's often asking for reactive things, and that's quite difficult for the research community to deal with. And there are issues around quality assurance, and things like should we be putting information into the public realm before it's peer reviewed, for example, is a question we often get asked. So I'm going to ask each of you, just to kick us off. I'm going to go with Henk first, because Henk, if that's all right, because I know you've been thinking a lot about this over the last couple of years. And then maybe Ed, if we can have a reflection from fisheries, and Ness from natural capital, that would be great. And Kim, I don't know, we might, if there are bits that haven't been covered, particularly around maybe how some of the data and information that's produced by industry is sort of feeding in. I don't know whether you might want to sort of talk to us about that, but Henk, I'll go with you first. So from your experience over the last couple of years, and also your experience in JNCC, how do you think research can best impact or create value in the policy landscape? Just a small question there.
Thanks, Dickon. Yeah. Well, it's as big as you want it to be, really. So I think there are lots of different angles and tangents to this. In its simplest terms, let's start off with, most of the folk on our call work in the research space. So the typical output of where you would get to at the end of a research project is your paper. Now, if you want to think about how to maximize the impact of that paper, I know that contributes to ref ratings, like in universities, but sending that paper on to people is a good way of getting people to read it, but people might not always understand the level of the detail or the nuance, in that research piece. So quite often, if you want to add value to your research, it's thinking about, okay, so what are the key things in this research paper that I want that person in my audience to know about? So if we take any one of the policy areas that Kim's mentioned, if your research is in that particular area, you can add value by looking up who would be a policy lead, someone working in that area, and having a conversation with them, asking them what sort of priorities they have, what are their challenges in that area, and then you can look to align what your key messages are with their challenges. So I would kick us off by saying starting to have that conversation is a really good way to start things off, and then thinking about those key messages to communicate on to that person. But it changes depending on the different areas that you're working in. So I know on the call we've got quite a few experts across a few different areas. I don't know whether that approach would change depending on whether you're dealing with a fisheries audience or a natural capital audience. I'm not quite sure who we'd want to hand on to next.
Well, I think that, thanks for that, Hank. That's really, so the issue of communication is really, really important, isn't it? Yeah. Understanding that people that don't work in academia may not understand the language that you use, but they are no less expert in that. They are experts in management and decision making, rather than natural science. And trying to bridge that communication barrier is often the most difficult thing, I think. And trying to keep things, it's not about keeping things as simple as possible, but it's about using language that isn't exclusive in some way, I think is really, really important. Ness, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Different, as you say, different spheres have different sort of requirements. And I think with natural capital, in my experience, we often, from an academic perspective, want to drive forward the agenda. We want to look at new methodologies, see where we can push the boundaries of the science and the interdisciplinary aspects of that. But actually, to integrate it into policy, we need to sort of take a step back and look really at the system. And also it needs to be question or outcome led. And I think that's where we often go wrong with natural capital, is we don't start from what's the problem, what are we trying to achieve. We just start with, you know, what can we value, or what can we do. So I think from a natural capital perspective, my key point would be really work backwards from what you're trying to influence, and if you can do that, then hopefully we'll get to a point where we can genuinely start integrating natural capital into policy and decision making.
It's such a good point, that, Ness. So we're currently doing work looking at reviewing marine monitoring in DEFRA, the entire English marine monitoring programme, and one of the things we're looking at in there is the monitoring being driven by actual requirements of people that are having to make decisions, or is it just being driven by the need to count stuff in a very reductive way? And actually you need a combination of those two things for it to be effective and efficient. So yeah, it's a really good point, Ness. Ed, traditionally I think fishery science is much closer linked to sort of management often, isn't it? I think, or is that wrong?
I think it is, relative to something like offshore wind, for example. That's certainly true. And maybe there are some lessons there from the way that sort of like fisheries science is developed. I guess one of the things to reflect on is there's still a sort of like a strong emphasis on things like stock assessments and trying to understand the biological. And then we had to move up to sort of trying to understand the ecosystem and sort of like implications there. And now there's sort of like this growth in trying to understand what the implications are on people, because ultimately this all sort of like really relates to, in some cases, livelihoods, and in other cases, you know, the management measures that we need to actually respond to some of these challenges and problems relate to people.
Yeah.
So I think there's a good bit of kind of cross fertilization that's starting to happen, and I think would be sort of wise for offshore wind to start thinking through that, particularly as you start having some of these potential spatial conflicts. The other thing is just like thinking about some of the research and where you can start having these impacts. I think across a lot of our work, we're often finding that we're starting to touch on issues and thinking of trade-offs and bigger issues that go beyond one sector. And I think that, again, is an area where just this sort of coherence across some of the research agendas would be really important to help us make progress to how we actually sort of respond to some of those trade-off questions.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Ed. The human element is really, really important, isn't it? And becoming more and more so. And it's kind of worth noting that I don't know how long Ed's social science team has been going in DEFRA, only a couple of years, isn't it? I think, but they're expanding rapidly, and really taking quite big strides into trying to bring social science, but also things like systems thinking into the way that they develop policy, which is really good to see. Great. Kim, I don't know whether there's anything from a sort of offshore wind perspective. Interestingly, in offshore wind, a lot of the research is sort of done by the developers, isn't it, through the EIA process? And so we've been working in ECOWind trying to think about how we get that information into the developers. And I don't know whether there's anything you might want to say about that at all.
Yeah, so ECOWind is doing a separate webinar to try and really discuss EIA with consultants, but this is really where the research coming out of ECOWind can have a really big change, because the way EIAs are done at the moment, it's just very considering species singularly rather than considering the full ecosystem-wide dynamics. And having the ECOWind research translate into how we do EIAs, as well as cumulative impact assessments, is going to really, really change the space and improve the whole process.
Do you know, it's such a good point, Kim, that the consultants are a group of people who are sort of left behind a little bit. That you think about developers and you think about government, but actually it's the group of people who are sat in consultancy, as both you and I used to be, who are doing the majority of the legwork in developing EIAs, and if we don't get the innovation out to that group of people, they are the ones that are actually going to make a lot of the change in offshore wind. That's a really good point. So we've got about 12 minutes left. We've got no questions yet, so I would encourage, if anyone has any questions for anybody, then do put them in. We've got coming up further, more detailed deep dives on strategic compensation, cumulative impact assessment, net gain, seabirds, marine spatial planning, 5 capitals, fisheries and marine monitoring. But I'd be really interested to know, for those of you on the panel, if you had to pick one area to say, actually, this is going to be not necessarily the biggest change, but some of the most important or interesting change or development in policy over the next 12 months. What do you think that would be? And Ed, I'm going to come to you first.
Yeah, I'm going to bang my drum about cumulative effects assessment, because I just think it shines a spotlight on so many things, and it brings in, for example, the importance of moving towards, say, natural capital. It brings in the ecosystem approach and all of that kind of stuff. And it's also a really good example of, so where we recently reviewed sort of existing approaches which are out there. If you then try and sort of like look through that research and see where it's been brought into practice and how it's influencing policy and all that sort of stuff, at the moment there's a huge gap there. So I guess the other bit, just sort of like linking a bit into that, sort of like the earlier question as well, is research impact. I think research on how to actually get some of the research into practice. Where are the blockages? What are the things which are actually sort of making it quite challenging? And I think part of that's that sort of disconnect. And again, cumulative effects assessment's just been such an interesting journey to kind of research and work in, because it shines so many spotlights on where you've got sort of challenges of bringing the research into an actual sort of delivery environment.
Great, thank you, Ed. Ness, I'm going to come to you next.
Yeah, well, I'm naturally going to say not quite totally natural capital approaches, but it sort of links to what Ed's just said about cumulative effect, and that's really around marine planning and that spatial squeeze and how that sort of comes out at the end. And I think sort of from a research perspective, how we look at trade-offs and sort of decision making around that, and the 5 capitals approach that we've sort of worked with for the MMO last year, and hoping to sort of start integrating into a few more sort of these research pieces. It's a way that allows you to consider not just natural capital, but really take a systems approach to thinking about all of those cause and effects, unexpected consequences, and sort of to really help you consider those trade-offs in decision making when you've got some really strong imperatives, very key drivers like the offshore wind, fisheries and the environment, just trying to work out how you can make those decisions. So sort of think quite a lot of modelling going on, but also just taking that more integrated approach. So yeah, lots going on in that space, and it's going to be really interesting to see the outcomes of MSPRE and how that integrates with the Crown Estate's whole of seabed approach. So I think that's a really busy and interesting space.
Yeah, linking back to what Ed was saying about cumulative effects assessment, and so from a research perspective, in that being able to it's going to be a fundamental requirement that we can deliver some form of ecosystem modelling, whether that's Bayesian modelling or other types of modelling, to be able to deliver some of that cumulative effects assessment. And it's so it's a real gap that I don't think anyone but the academic community can step into. We've got Henk and Kim, I'll come back to you, but we've got a question that I just want to make sure we've got time for. Jethro has asked, how will impact assessments be handled under the new regime of aiming to achieve consent in a year? Will there be more focus on sensitivity mapping and sharing existing data between developers? It's a really good question, Jethro. I my personal view is that I think that year target is very difficult. And I think the year target is likely to be met by looking at breaking up process rather than saying end to end is going to be a year. So, for example, if you're looking at birds, I think the current requirement is you need at least 3 years of monitoring data. And so it's understanding, is that a year from the application being submitted, which I think it is, with all the supporting information, to being determined. That's right, isn't it, Kim? I think
so.
Yeah. So this is more about trying to get consensus on information, so that currently what happens is when the impact assessments go into examination, you're often in quite a confrontational environment where you've got two sets of experts both putting forward their own view of the world. And one of the things that we're trying to do, not just in ECOWind and EcoFlow, but also the Offshore Wind Evidence and Change programme, the Scottish Marine Environmental Research ScotMER programme, and others, is looking to try and develop consensus on what the evidence base is telling us, so that we aren't having to have the same arguments again and again and again at examination level, but actually we can get some sort of consensus on what the technical position is, so that the examination goes more smoothly. I think there's always going to be some level of friction in the examination process, but the idea, I think, is to try and get as much consensus on that information up front as possible. Kim, Ed, I don't know whether you've got a view on that. You might be closer to some of those bits than I am.
I was just thinking one possible addition. I think there's at least an intention to move towards some of that strategic planning and emphasizing that sort of like initial bit. Hence some of that CEA project for the government advisors, to try and, as you say, try and move towards the point where there's sort of like a greater agreement of the sort of like the starting conditions and so on, so that it should make it a more focused process on where those particular problems are identified.
Yeah. Okay. Kim, I don't know if you had anything to add to that.
Yeah, just to kind of repeat that, it's having a consensus on the impacts that we really think that we need to have more data on and delve into more, and the impacts that we have certainty on, or we may not be 100% confident, but we're confident enough to move away from and focus on the really important key issues that we're facing.
Great. So Jordan's put a really interesting question, and this touches on some of what we were talking about with Henk. What's a good way for the academic community to get ahead of the curve? A lot of the time they're researching areas that are behind current developments, which may make it difficult to make policy change to what has already been done. So it's interesting. Sometimes you are researching stuff that is behind, but often you're researching stuff that's quite a long way in front. So understanding that so your the first step, almost, I would say, is that it's important that you can try and understand the world that they work in. So coming as much as possible to events like this, trying to take an active interest in policy, and sometimes that means just, so all the government departments have mailing lists that you can go on to gov.uk, and they'll send you alerts. So whenever they put a consultation out on marine, you'll get it into your inbox. You'll be able to understand what they're doing. Whenever there are opportunities for things like contributing to post notes, which are the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, there will be people in your departments. There always is one or two individuals in every department who is working with some of the government agencies, and unfortunately, just it's human nature that a lot of the way some of this works is just through relationships, going to conferences, going to things. and I'm not just plugging this because I sit in the organising committee, but going to things like Coastal Futures, we hardly get any academics there, and all we talk about is policy and management for 2 days, and there are 150 people in the room, and that's all they do. So stepping a little bit outside of your comfort zone in terms of what you would traditionally consider your kind of background reading and keeping up with your kind of day-to-day stuff. Other examples of good kind of things like that, I'm going to plug the ICES conference that's going on in Gateshead over the summer. That will have a really good mix of scientists and policymakers in it as well. There's like sessions on everything there as well, but also the Mars conference that goes on up in Scotland's good too. And Henk, I've got to plug the Insight conference as well, the science, the structures in the marine environment that's going on up in Glasgow, which will have academics, policymakers, industry people there, all talking about oil and gas and offshore wind. Has anyone got anything they want to add on that?
I'll go for something. Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I think that the Fisheries Act is a really good example of something. I mean, if you actually kind of like sit down and read the policy, and then just question a little bit, okay, so those are your policy objectives. Well, how are you going to do that then? And it's quite a good way of just sort of working out where some of those sort of snags are likely to come forward, and where there's kind of like good areas, I think, to get research sort of targeted at emerging problems. So by using that example a bit more with the Fisheries Act, there's the climate change objective in there. You've also got one which is on sustainability, which includes social sustainability. So if you're sort of like talking about reducing carbon emissions from the fleet, for example, and you're talking about reaching ecological sustainability on overfished stocks, how are you then going to meet that social sustainability objective also? So kind of like delving into the policy, I think, and doing a little bit of questioning and kind of like mapping it out can lead you into some really interesting avenues to go away and get ahead of the curve a bit on what research needs are.
Yeah. Thank you, Ed. We've got a really good question from Julia in the chat that I want to cover in our last 5 minutes. She makes a really good point of on the point of communication and science being difficult to interpret for non-experts. Communication goes both ways, and as a scientist, she finds it easier to read research papers because that's where she's come from than understanding policy briefs. Is there a reverse equivalent to a research summary for policymakers, like a policy overview for research? So scientists can understand more easily what would be useful to policies. So Henk, I'm going to come to you because I know you've got lots to say on this, but I'm also going to put in the chat the link to the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, their post note series, which is really useful. Those are a set of briefings that have been written about science for parliamentarians effectively, so they're written in language that hopefully both groups can understand. But also, Henk, you've probably got some other areas you can point people. I know there's lots of work being done on things like OWIR and stuff like that for people.
Sure. But just to say, Julia, I feel your pain. When I worked as a researcher, I used to think exactly the same thing, and yeah, it's a lot of it is a communication issue, and where human beings tend to communicate more reasonably is at the conversation level. So there's a lot of stuff that you can read, and I think it's great. Dickens going to post those notes, post the post-it notes as such. And there's a lot you can read. There are a lot of people who put a lot of effort into try to ease that communication both ways. But I think the easiest forms of communication tend to be conversations. And so once you've read up and got to that certain point, and I'm the same with this, I get to a certain point where there's just some things I just don't understand. Reaching out to people in that field who know the policy or the science work implicitly, they can often cut through all of the jargon, all the difficulties, and communicate it in a way that maybe you understand it. And so I think what I'm saying is there's definite benefit of having sort of more communication across So science, policy, industry, academia, government interfaces, because this is where you can have the most basic kind of conversations around really complex topics, and you can start to shed more light on things.
Yeah, it doesn't. It's not an easy thing both ways, I think, and I think there is an assumption that actually the policy community can pick up science and easily use it, and the science community can pick up policy and easily use it. And we've been fortunate enough to pull a group of people together who have got experience in spanning boundaries and crossing those boundaries. But unless you it takes experience and training and all the rest of it, as well as any other job does, to cross those boundaries. And I think one of the key things that we've learned from some of the NERT programs we're working on is that actually, if you don't invest the time and effort, sometimes in dedicated resources within projects to be able to do the communication, not just the communication job, the science policy interface job well, it won't happen organically. And just thinking about the OWET project Poseidon, as well as ours, where they had, I think, 1 or 2 postdocs employed full time just to do that science policy interface. It was Poseidon, I think, wasn't it, Hank? Is it Poseidon or Prepared? I can't remember.
Prepared, but yeah, one of those projects. Yeah.
So setting that dedicated resource aside is really, really important, as well as far as possible as trying to just immerse yourself in another person's world, I guess. Ness, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, sort of a slight side, but I think relevant, is sort of I've sort of worked on and been involved in a lot of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary projects, and one of the first things I always try to do is actually set up a dictionary, and not sort of terminology, but just what we mean by different things. Because if you ask, particularly in the natural capital world, ask someone what value means across different disciplines, and you get really different answers. And so it's really important that we understand that language. And I don't know if that's something, you know, to expand on in the future, is sort of alongside all of these policy briefs, is actually a sort of policy dictionary that sort of sets out what all of these things mean, and just basically that policy realm is quite confusing even to people that work in it. So, you know, maybe that's something on us as a team that we could take forward and develop.
Yeah, well, hopefully we can have more of those conversations, deep dives onto different topics as we go through this year. And unfortunately, we've come to an end there. I think we could talk for hours on the science policy interaction, how we can make that work better. But we will be definitely looking into these in much more detail across a whole range of topics over the rest of this year. Our next webinar is going to be on the 15th of May, and we're going to be talking about strategic compensation, which is effectively compensation for environmental effects, mainly from offshore wind, that is being delivered at a strategic level, so across projects or over large biogeographic spaces, which is a topic that many in government are really trying to struggle with, and we'll be explaining to you what strategic compensation is, why it's important, and where some of your research can really make a difference. The last thing I'd say is thank you to everybody for coming today. This webinar has been recorded, so we will be putting it up on the website. I hope you've found it to be useful. I've certainly enjoyed taking part. I would like to really thank Kim for her presentation, and Ed, Henk and Ness for taking part on the panel. I hope you have a good rest of the day, and we will see you at the next one. Great. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.